Think herding geese sounds peaceful? In 1380, it was chaos wrapped in feathers. You're barefoot? It's dawn. The mud is freezing. And 30 furious honking birds are headed straight for the barley field again. There are no fences, no dog to help, and no off switch on a goose with attitude. Spoiler, they bite. They scream, and they don't care that you're the Lord's son or just a sleepy peasant. Love winding down with weird, muddy, medieval jobs. Subscribe and hit the bell icon for more historical bedtime misery. One clumsy job at a time. And tell us in the comments, would you rather herd geese or milk a goat before breakfast? You wake before the monastery bells ring prime. Somewhere around 3 in the morning by our modern reckoning. Though time moves differently in 1380, the darkness outside your family's single-room hut is complete. Broken only by the dying embers. In the central hearth that had been carefully banked to last through the night, your bare feet touch the earthen floor, feeling the familiar mixture of packed dirt and straw that serves as your family's foundation. The air is thick with smoke. From the hearth there are no windows to let it escape, just a hole in the thatch. Roof that rarely draws properly. Your name is Margot, and you are 12 years old, though you stopped counting birthdays after your 10th winter. Age matters less than capability in medieval England, and you've been deemed capable enough to serve as the village's goose girl for Hinderclay Manor in Suffolk. This responsibility fell to you not through choice, but through the inexorable machinery of feudal obligation. Your father, like 85% of England's population, is a villain bound to Lord Reynolds Manor, obligated to work his strips of land in exchange for protection and the right to exist. The geese are your burden because someone must tend them, and you represent the perfect intersection of expendability and trustworthiness that medieval economics demands. Too young for the back-breaking work of plowing and harvesting, too old to be entirely useless. You occupy that narrow space where a child becomes valuable to the manor's complex web of agricultural production. Lord Reynolds' steward, Master Edmund, announced your appointment last Michaelmas with the casual authority that governs every aspect of peasant life. The Goddard girl will mind the geese this season. British agricultural history records show that goose herding in late medieval England was primarily a light summer and early autumn activity. But this tells only part of the story. The geese require constant vigilance from the moment spring arrives and the breeding season begins. February through March marks the laying period, when each goose in your care will produce between 3 and 12 eggs. Depending on her age, health, and the whims of providence that govern all agricultural endeavors in this era, you stumble through the pre-dawn darkness toward the wooden coop that houses your charges. The structure itself represents a significant investment of resources, timber, thatch, iron nails that cost more than your family sees in a month. Notes that specific shelters were built for housing the geese by night. And Hinderclay's goose house reflects the manor's commitment to protecting valuable livestock. 23 birds huddle within, their white forms barely visible in the gloom. These geese embody the complex economics of medieval animal husbandry. Unlike chickens, which can be managed with minimal oversight, geese require careful ratio management. One gander serves no more than 4 females. Biological constraint that limits flock expansion and demands constant attention to breeding dynamics. Each bird represents not just immediate value, but future investment. A productive goose might live 5 to 7 years, laying eggs each spring, and producing goslings that will either join the flock or contribute to the manor's income through sale or consumption. The sound that greets you as you approach the coop is distinctive, a low, rumbling conversation of soft honks and rustling feathers. Geese are social creatures, far more complex in their relationships than the sheep or cattle that represent the backbone of medieval agriculture. They mate for life, forming bonds that influence every aspect of flock management. When a goose loses her partner, she may refuse to breed the following season, disrupting careful production plans and threatening the delicate balance of the manor's economy. Your first task each morning involves a detailed inspection that would challenge modern veterinarians. You must assess each bird's health by touch and observation, looking for signs of disease, injury, or the subtle indicators that predict future problems. Mortality rates in medieval goose flocks averaged around 4% annually, but this figure conceals the devastating impact of periodic epidemics that could kill 25% of a flock in a single season. The eggs present their own challenges. Goose eggs are large, valuable, and fragile each. One represents potential income or food security for the manor. They must be collected carefully, counted precisely, and allocated according to the stewards. Detailed instructions. Some will be set under broody geese for hatching, others under requisitioned hens when the goose herself cannot accommodate her entire clutch. The surplus eggs might find their way to Lord Reynolds' table, be sold in the weekly market, or stored in water glass for later consumption. As you move among the birds in the pre-dawn darkness, you can feel the weight of responsibility that medieval society places on even its youngest members. Your job is not simply to tend animals. You are a critical component in a complex system of resource management that determines whether the manor prospers or struggles in the coming year. The geese under your care will provide meat for harvest, feasts, eggs for the Lord's table, feathers for bedding and arrows, and goslings that represent the future of the entire enterprise. The darkness begins to lighten, almost imperceptibly as you complete your morning inspection. Soon you will need to drive the flock out to the common pasture, where they will spend their day grazing under your watchful eye. But first, there are more immediate concerns that demand attention, the constant vigilance required to keep valuable livestock alive in a world filled with predators, disease, and 1,000 small disasters that can destroy months of careful work. What challenges await as the sun rises over Hinderclay Manor? And how will a 12-year-old girl navigate the complex demands of medieval animal husbandry? The first pale light of dawn reveals the true complexity of your task as Hinderclay's goose girl. What appeared manageable in the darkness of the coop becomes daunting in daylight, as 23 individual personalities assert themselves with the rising sun. Each goose has her own temperament, her own preferred grazing spots, her own relationships. Within the flock hierarchy that you must understand and navigate to maintain order, Master Edmund provided you with a staff the length of your arm, a simple hazel rod that serves as both walking stick and herding tool. This modest implement represents the only authority you wield over birds that can weigh 15 pounds and possess beaks capable of inflicting serious injury. Geese are not docile creatures. They are intelligent, strong-willed, and entirely capable of ignoring a 12-year-old girl if they determine she lacks the resolve to enforce her commands. The common pasture of Hinderclay village stretches before you as you drive the flock through the narrow lanes between cottages. Explains that these would be taken to pasture on the common land of the village, together with those of the neighbors. But this simple statement conceals the intricate negotiations and unspoken agreements that govern access to grazing rights. The commons represent one of medieval society's most crucial institutions, shared resources that allow even the poorest villagers to maintain livestock. But commons are not empty land. They are carefully managed systems with complex rules governing who may graze what animals, when, and for how long. As the manor's official goose girl, you have preferential access to the best grazing areas. But this privilege comes with corresponding responsibilities that extend far beyond simple animal supervision. Your flock mingles with geese from other households as you reach the main grazing area. Village children from families too poor to afford a dedicated herder have driven their smaller flocks to join yours, creating a community of perhaps 60 birds under your nominal supervision. The social dynamics that emerge challenge every assumption about the simplicity of rural life. Older geese establish dominance over prime feeding spots, forcing younger birds to forage in marginal areas. Ganders engage in territorial disputes that can escalate into violent confrontations, potentially injuring valuable breeding stock. The feeding behavior of geese presents constant challenges that test your developing expertise. Unlike cows or sheep, which graze uniformly across available pasture, geese are selective feeders with preferences that can devastate certain areas, while leaving others untouched. They seek out tender grass shoots, clover, and the broad leaves of plants that provide optimal nutrition for egg production and general health. This selectivity means that popular feeding areas quickly become overgrazed, forcing you to continuously move the flock to prevent permanent damage to the commons. British agricultural history records indicate that geese tend to feed on grassland, but also notes that there are some patchy references to them also being given grain. The reality of medieval goose nutrition involves careful supplementation with barley, chaff, and whole grain, particularly during periods when pasture quality declines or when birds require additional nutrition for breeding and growth. The grain supplements represent a significant expense for the manor, requiring careful calculation of costs versus benefits. 2/4 of barley chaff can sustain the entire flock during lean periods, but barley has alternative use as brewing, ale feeding horses, or providing human nutrition during food shortages. Your role extends beyond simple herding to include monitoring the birds' body condition and advising Master Edmund when additional feeding becomes necessary. Predation pressure adds another layer of complexity to your daily routine. The pastoral landscape of medieval England supports healthy populations of foxes, wolves, and wild dogs that view your flock as readily available protein. Mentions the need to defend flocks from predators, for example, hawks while grazing. But ground-based threats pose far greater dangers than aerial attacks. The morning hours require constant vigilance. As you scan hedgerows and woodland edges for movement that might indicate stalking predators, your young eyes must distinguish between the harmless rustle of wind through leaves and the purposeful movements of hunting animals. The staff in your hands becomes a weapon when necessary, though its effectiveness against a determined fox or a pack of wild dogs remains questionable. Domestic animals present unexpected threats to your flock. Pigs from neighboring households sometimes break free from their own supervision and pose significant dangers to geese. British agricultural history specifically mentions that goose herds must protect flocks from potentially hazardous animals, both wild and domestic, including pigs that might attack or scatter the birds. The spring weather of 1380 adds its own challenges to your daily routine. Notes that solar activity records show a decline from 1250 to 1350, a brief rise from 1350 to 1380, and then a phenomenal low that lasted until 1500. This period of climatic instability means unpredictable weather patterns that can suddenly threaten your flock with late frosts, unexpected storms, or prolonged periods of rain that turn pastures into muddy quagmires. Wet conditions create particular problems for geese, despite their association with water. While they enjoy access to ponds and streams for drinking and bathing, prolonged exposure to cold, wet weather can lead to respiratory infections and other health problems that devastate flock productivity. Your responsibility includes recognizing weather patterns that might endanger the birds and making decisions about when to return them to shelter earlier than normal. The social isolation of your position becomes apparent as the morning progresses, while other village children work alongside family members or friends. Your role as goose girl separates you from peer relationships and normal childhood activities. The birds demand constant attention, leaving little opportunity for the games and social interactions that occupy other children your age. This isolation represents one of the hidden costs of specialization in medieval societies, often comes at the expense of normal social development. As the sun climbs higher and the morning feeding period reaches its natural conclusion, you face decisions that will influence the rest of your day. The flock has grazed the easily accessible areas of the commons, but prime feeding spots remain. In locations that require careful navigation of property boundaries, seasonal restrictions, and the complex web of rights and obligations that govern medieval land use. How do you balance the immediate needs of your flock against the long-term sustainability of grazing resources? And what happens when the inevitable conflicts arise with other users of the commons? The long day draws toward its close as shadows lengthen across Hinderclay's common pasture, and you face the most challenging part of your daily routine as Goose Girl. Driving the flock back to their shelter requires skills that extend far beyond simple animal herding. After a full day of grazing, the geese have scattered across the commons in small groups, each following their own internal rhythms and social relationships that you must understand and manipulate to reassemble the flock. Geese are creatures of habit, but their habits do not necessarily align with human convenience. Some birds linger near the pond that serves as their primary water source, reluctant to abandon the security of familiar territory. Others have wandered to the edges of the commons, testing boundaries and exploring areas that might offer superior foraging opportunities. A few individuals have established themselves in prime locations and resist any effort to disturb their comfortable positions. Your hazel staff becomes an extension of your will as you begin the complex process of gathering scattered birds. The technique requires patience, understanding of goose psychology, and physical stamina that challenges your 12-year-old frame. Moving too quickly or aggressively will scatter the flock further, but excessive hesitation allows individuals to ignore your authority and continue their preferred activities. The social hierarchy within the flock influences every aspect of the gathering process. Dominant birds expect deference from their inferiors and will fight to maintain their preferred positions within the group. Submissive geese look to their superiors for guidance about when and where to move, creating complex chains of command that you must navigate without disrupting the delicate balance of relationships. Master Edmund appears at the edge of the commons. As you work to gather the flock, his presence adding urgency to your efforts. The steward's daily inspection represents the moment when your competence faces official scrutiny. He counts birds with practiced efficiency, checking for missing animals that might indicate predation, theft, or simple mismanagement. His sharp eyes assess the condition of each bird, looking for signs of injury, illness, or inadequate nutrition that would reflect poorly on your performance. 23 birds went out this morning, he announces in the clipped tones of authority, and 23 must return. The simple arithmetic conceals the complex challenges you have faced throughout the day. Keeping track of individual animals in a mixed flock while managing grazing, predation, pressure, and weather conditions requires skills that most adults would find challenging. The accounting extends beyond simple numbers to include qualitative assessments that determine your future role within the manor's hierarchy. Master Edmund examines several birds closely, checking their weight by feel and assessing their general health through practiced observation. A declining condition would suggest inadequate management and might result in reassignment to less critical duties. British agricultural history indicates that death rates were exceedingly low, just over 4% on average. But this statistic represents an annual figure that encompasses both good and bad management. Daily vigilance and competent herding determine whether individual flocks achieve these averages or suffer higher losses that impact the manor's economic performance. The economic implications of your work become apparent as Master Edmund discusses plans for the coming weeks. The spring breeding season approaches its peak, and several geese show signs of beginning their brooding cycles. Success in hatching and raising goslings will determine the flock's expansion, and the manor's income from goose-related activities throughout the year. The widow Bess will provide 2 broody hens for the excess eggs. Master Edmund explains, referring to the complex arrangements necessary to maximize hatching success. Geese typically lay between 3 and 12 eggs, but their ability to successfully incubate and hatch large clutches is limited. Distributing excess eggs to broody hens increases the total number of goslings that survive to maturity. Though it requires careful coordination between different households and livestock managers, the approaching evening meal highlights another aspect of your responsibilities that extends beyond simple animal care. As Goose Girl, you occupy a specific position within the manor's social hierarchy that influences your access to food, shelter, and other necessities. Your successful performance of duties earns you a share of barley bread and small ale, along with occasional portions of cheese or meat when the manor's fortunes permit such luxuries. Describes the harsh realities of peasant nutrition. Peasants generally lived in small houses which normally consisted of only one room. A fire burned in the hearth in the center, which would create a very smoky environment. Your success as Goose Girl provides marginal improvements to these basic living conditions, but the underlying constraints of medieval poverty remain constant. Pressures on your daily existence. The evening inspection reveals subtle changes in individual birds that reflect the seasonal progression toward breeding activities. Several geese show the behavioral changes that indicate approaching egg-laying, increased territorial behavior, preferences for specific nesting areas, and the physical signs that experienced livestock managers learn to recognize. These observations will inform tomorrow's activities and influence decisions about supplemental feeding, nest preparation, and breeding management. As darkness falls and you secure the flock in their shelter, the day's work transitions into evening responsibilities that continue well past sunset. The geese require final inspection for injuries or illness. Water containers must be checked and refilled, and the shelter itself needs maintenance to ensure adequate protection from both weather and predators. The broader implications of your role become apparent as you reflect on the day's activities. Your work as Goose Girl represents one small component in the vast agricultural system that supports medieval society. The success or failure of your efforts influences not just the immediate welfare of 23 birds, but the economic health of the entire manor and the food security of everyone who depends on its productive capacity. The spring of 1380 represents a critical moment in English history, as social tensions that would explode into the peasants' revolt the following year continue to build throughout the countryside. Your daily struggles with geese reflect broader challenges facing rural communities as they navigate changing economic conditions, climatic instability, and the mounting pressures that would ultimately reshape English society. What forces beyond your control shape the world in which you labor? And how do the mundane details of goose herding connect to the larger historical currents that will define the late 14th century? The confrontation that followed Walter's goose across the boundary line illustrates the complex intersection of personal honor, community loyalty, and economic necessity that governed medieval rural life. Geoffrey Miller was not simply protecting grass. He was defending his village's collective rights against encroachment that threatened their long-term survival. His authority as shepherd derived from Eastwick's trust in his judgment about matters that could Brother Thomas of Walsingham would never record it in his chronicles. But the event that nearly destroyed 3 villages began with a single goose crossing an invisible line on a dewy morning in May 1380. You might think such a minor transgression would pass unnoticed in the grand scheme of medieval politics. But you would be fundamentally mistaken about how property, prestige, and survival intersected in 14th century England. The goose belonged to Walter Carpenter of Thornham Village, though ownership itself represented a complex web of obligations, rights, and traditional privileges that defied simple definition. Walter held his single bird under the ancient custom of fold-soak, a feudal arrangement that allowed certain tenants to maintain poultry in exchange for specific services to their lord. The goose represented not just livestock, but Walter's hereditary right to participate in the community's economic life, despite his family's precarious position at the very bottom of the social hierarchy. The invisible line that the goose crossed marked the boundary between Thornham's Commons and the grazing lands claimed by the neighboring village of Eastwick. These boundaries had been established generations earlier through a combination of royal charters, manorial grants, and the accumulated weight of tradition that governed every aspect of medieval land use. They were marked by ancient stones, twisted oak trees, and the subtle topographical features that trained eyes could read like written law. But boundaries, however ancient, remain meaningful only as long as the communities that recognize them retain the power to enforce their claims. By 1380, that power was shifting in ways that would have profound consequences for rural England. The Black Death had killed between 30 and 40% of the population over the previous generation, disrupting traditional relationships between lords and tenants, creating labor shortages that empowered surviving peasants, and generating social tensions that undermined established hierarchies. Notes that medieval village life revolved around carefully managed common resources. But the management systems were beginning to break down under demographic and economic pressures that no one fully understood. Commons that had adequately supported larger populations now seemed almost luxuriously spacious, tempting neighboring communities to expand their traditional grazing areas into disputed territories. The morning that Walter's goose wandered across the boundary, she was pursuing her own agenda patch of particularly tender clover that grew in soil enriched by decades of sheep droppings. Geese are intelligent animals with excellent memories for productive foraging areas, and she had discovered this location during previous expeditions that tested the limits of acceptable behavior. Her transgression might have passed unnoticed, except for the presence of Geoffrey Miller, whose own responsibilities as Eastwick shepherd made him acutely aware of anything that threatened his village's grazing rights. Geoffrey's reaction to the trespassing goose reflected decades of mounting tension between the two communities over resource access. Thornham's population had declined less severely than Eastwick's during the plague years, creating an imbalance that put additional pressure on shared boundaries. Thornham's animals increasingly spilled over onto traditionally neutral ground, while Eastwick's reduced numbers made it difficult to maintain effective control over their traditional territories determine whether their animals thrived or starved in the coming winter. "That bird has no business on Eastwick ground," Geoffrey announced with the sort of formal declaration that medieval society required for serious disputes. The language he used was carefully chosen to invoke legal precedents while avoiding accusations that might escalate the situation beyond local resolution. But his tone carried implications that both men understood perfectly. This was not merely about one goose, but about the broader pattern of territorial expansion that Thornham had been pursuing. Walter's response revealed the defensive position that made such conflicts intractable. "She's doing no harm to anyone," he replied, using language that emphasized the harmless nature of his goose while carefully avoiding any acknowledgement of boundary violations. His words were technically accurate. A single goose could hardly damage extensive pasture lands, but they ignored the principle that unlimited small violations would eventually destroy the commons system entirely. The two men stood facing each other across a landscape that appeared peaceful and abundant to casual observation, but which represented a carefully balanced ecosystem under increasing stress. The grass beneath their feet had been grazed by countless generations of animals, according to traditional patterns that prevented overuse and maintained long-term productivity. Those patterns depended on mutual respect for boundaries that were becoming increasingly difficult to enforce. Explains that medieval goose management required common pasture, accessible to villagers who lacked sufficient private land to support their animals independently. But the common system worked only when all participants respected the traditional limitations that prevented any individual or community from claiming more than their fair share of shared resources. The broader context of their dispute reflected changes sweeping across rural England as the traditional feudal system adapted to post-plague realities. Labor shortages had increased the bargaining power of surviving peasants, who demanded higher wages, better working conditions, and greater autonomy from their lords. These same changes made communities more assertive about their collective rights and more willing to challenge traditional arrangements that seemed to favor their neighbors. The economic implications extended far beyond the immediate dispute over grazing rights. Both villages depended on their ability to maintain livestock through the winter months, when natural forage became unavailable and communities relied on stored hay, grain supplements, and carefully managed access to remaining pasture. Any reduction in available grazing could force difficult choices between reducing animal numbers or risking malnutrition that would compromise breeding success the following year. As the morning sun climbed higher, more villagers became aware of the confrontation developing on the boundary between their communities. Children who had been driving geese to pasture stopped to observe the increasingly formal exchange between Geoffrey and Walter. Women carrying water from the common well altered their routes to gather information about the dispute. Men working in nearby fields paused in their labors to assess whether the situation might require their intervention. The gathering crowd transformed a simple boundary dispute into a community crisis that tested established procedures for resolving conflicts. Between villages, medieval society had developed elaborate mechanisms for handling such situations. But those mechanisms depended on the authority of lords and officials who might have their own interests in the outcome. Local solutions required consensus among people who understood their mutual dependence, but who also competed for limited resources essential to their survival. The social dynamics of the expanding confrontation reflected the complex loyalties that governed medieval rural life. Family relationships crossed village boundaries, creating networks of obligation and affection that complicated purely territorial disputes. Economic relationships linked the communities through marriages, shared labor arrangements, and trading partnerships that would suffer if the conflict escalated beyond peaceful resolution. But as more people gathered on both sides of the invisible boundary line, the pressure for formal resolution increased beyond what local diplomacy could manage. Someone would need to make authoritative decisions about grazing rights, compensation for alleged damages, and the precedents that would govern future interactions between the communities. Those decisions would require invoking legal authorities whose involvement might permanently alter the traditional relationships that had maintained peace for generations. What forces would determine how this seemingly trivial dispute about one wandering goose would be resolved, and what precedents would be established for managing the increasingly complex conflicts over common resources? By midday, what had begun as a simple dispute between two men over a wandering goose had transformed into a confrontation that threatened to engulf 3 villages in legal warfare that could last for decades. The invisible boundary line between Thornham and Eastwick had become a physical barrier marked by 2 groups of increasingly agitated villagers, each convinced that their fundamental rights were under attack by unreasonable neighbors. The transformation reflected the peculiar mathematics of medieval social conflict, where individual grievances multiplied into community crises through the inexorable logic of collective responsibility. Walter Carpenter's goose was no longer simply his property, but had become a symbol of Thornham's alleged encroachment on Eastwick's traditional territories. Geoffrey Miller's objection had evolved from pastoral concern into a test of his village's determination to defend their ancient privileges against systematic erosion. Master Robert de Clare, the bailiff responsible for maintaining order in this region of Suffolk, arrived at noon with the sort of weary resignation that experienced officials developed when dealing with boundary disputes. He had seen similar conflicts escalate into violence that claimed lives, destroyed property, and generated legal proceedings that consumed resources for years without producing satisfactory resolution. His presence represented both an opportunity for peaceful settlement and the first step toward formal legal proceedings that neither community could afford. The bailiff's investigation revealed the complex history that made the current dispute virtually impossible to resolve through simple appeals to precedent or law. The boundary between Thornham and Eastwick had been established in 1247 by royal charter that granted specific grazing rights to each community. But the charter's language was sufficiently ambiguous to support conflicting interpretations about the precise location of territorial limits. Subsequent agreements, modifications, and informal understandings had created a layered system of claims that defied straightforward adjudication. British agricultural history notes that medieval manorial accounts often recorded disputes over grazing rights that reflected the economic implications of goose rearing within complex systems of land management. But the scholarly language concealed the human drama of communities fighting for survival in an economic system that offered little margin for error or compromise. The third village that would eventually be drawn into the conflict was Westfield, whose grazing lands bordered both Thornham and Eastwick along boundaries that were even more poorly defined than those between the original disputants. Westfield's residents had been watching the confrontation with growing alarm, recognizing that any precedent established in the current dispute would inevitably influence their own territorial claims and grazing rights. As Master Robert questioned witnesses and examined boundary markers, the scope of the underlying problem became apparent. The current dispute was not an isolated incident, but the latest manifestation of tensions that had been building for years. As traditional resource management systems struggled to adapt to changing demographic and economic conditions, similar conflicts were erupting throughout rural England as communities renegotiated relationships that had been stable for generations. The economic stakes involved in the goose dispute reflected broader changes in medieval agriculture that were transforming rural society. Explains that goose raising had evolved from simple subsistence activity into a specialized enterprise that required access to specific types of grazing land and seasonal resources. Villages that lost access to traditional territories might find themselves unable to maintain the livestock operations that had become essential to their economic survival. The legal complexity of the situation challenged Master Robert's authority and expertise in ways that illustrated the limitations of medieval administrative systems. The royal charter that established the original boundaries had been drafted in Latin by clerks who had never visited the disputed territory, and who relied on local testimony that might have been incomplete or deliberately misleading. Subsequent documents that modified or clarified the original grants were scattered among various archives, some of which were held by religious institutions, whose cooperation could not be assumed. The involvement of the church added another layer of complexity to the dispute, as both villages claimed ancient rights that had been confirmed by ecclesiastical authorities, whose legal status remained unclear. Thornham asserted that their grazing privileges had been blessed by the abbot of Bury St. Edmunds in 1298, while Eastwick produced documents suggesting that their territorial claims had been recognized by the Bishop of Norwich in 1312. Neither claim could be easily verified, and both religious authorities had their own interests in maintaining good relationships with communities that provided significant support to their institutions. As the afternoon progressed, the gathering crowd began to include individuals whose presence transformed the local dispute into a regional crisis with implications that extended far beyond the immediate participants. Sir William de Burgh, the knight who held ultimate feudal authority over all three villages, arrived with a small retinue that suggested he viewed the situation as potentially serious enough to require military intervention. His presence elevated the stakes considerably, as any decision he made would establish precedents that could influence property rights. Throughout his extensive holdings, the Knight's investigation revealed connections between the current dispute and broader political tensions that were building throughout England in the months before the Peasants' Revolt. Similar conflicts over common resources were occurring in dozens of communities, as traditional authorities struggled to maintain order in a society undergoing fundamental transformation. The grievances that would eventually explode into open rebellion were already visible in local disputes that seemed to involve nothing more than grazing rights and boundary markers. BBC History notes that by late 1380, peasant discontent reached a breaking point due to various economic and social pressures, including disputes over traditional rights and privileges that formed the foundation of rural society. The Goose conflict at Thornham reflected the same underlying tensions that were generating similar confrontations throughout the countryside. The social dynamics of the expanding dispute illustrated the complex loyalties and obligations that governed medieval rural life. Family relationships that crossed village boundaries created networks of support and mutual assistance, but they also generated conflicts of interest when communities found themselves in opposition. Men who had worked together during harvest season now faced each other across territorial boundaries that seemed increasingly significant as the dispute escalated. The economic implications of the conflict extended far beyond the immediate question of grazing rights to include broader issues of resource access, market participation, and community autonomy that would influence the long-term viability of rural settlements. Villages that lost traditional privileges might find themselves unable to maintain the economic activities that supported their populations, potentially forcing residents to seek opportunities elsewhere or accept reduced living standards that threatened their survival. The legal procedures that Master Robert Bassi was required to follow reflected medieval society's preference for formal resolution of disputes through established institutional channels. But those procedures were expensive, time-consuming, and often produced outcomes that satisfied no one involved. The alternative allowing communities to resolve conflicts through negotiation or, potentially, violence offered greater flexibility but also greater risks to social order and individual safety. As evening approached and the immediate crisis required some form of temporary resolution, the participants faced difficult choices about how to proceed. The seemingly simple question of where Walter Carpenter's goose was allowed to graze had revealed fundamental disagreements about property rights, community autonomy, and the authority of various institutions to make binding decisions about rural life. What mechanisms existed for resolving such complex disputes? And how would the decisions made in this local conflict influence the broader social tensions that were building toward the dramatic events of 1381? The resolution of the Goose boundary dispute would come to be remembered not for its wisdom, but for its demonstration of how medieval legal systems could transform minor infractions into community disasters that lasted for generations. Master Robert de Clare, faced with conflicting claims that seemed impossible to reconcile through existing law, attempted a compromise that satisfied no one and established precedents that would haunt all three villages for decades to come. The bailiff's decision reflected the inherent limitations of medieval administrative systems when confronted with complex disputes over traditional rights and customary privileges. Unable to definitively establish the precise location of ancient boundaries, he proposed dividing the disputed territory into rotating seasonal access that would theoretically give each community fair use of the contested grazing lands. Thornham would have access during spring months, Eastwick during summer, and Westfield during autumn, with winter access shared among all three villages, according to carefully calculated proportions based on their relative population and livestock numbers. The mathematical precision of this solution concealed fundamental misunderstandings about how medieval commons actually functioned in practice. Seasonal rotation worked for agricultural activities like plowing and harvesting, where timing could be adjusted to accommodate shared access. But grazing animals required continuous access to resources that varied in quality and availability. Throughout the year, the proposed system would force communities to adjust their livestock management practices in ways that compromised the economic viability of their herds and flocks. British agricultural history explains that medieval goose management required access to different types of pasture throughout the seasonal cycle, with specific timing requirements that reflected the bird's natural breeding and feeding behaviors. Spring access was essential for laying geese that needed high-quality forage to produce viable eggs, while autumn access provided the stubble grazing that fattened birds for winter slaughter and market sales. The implementation of Master Roberts' compromise revealed its practical impossibility within weeks of its announcement. Thornham's spring access to the disputed territory coincided exactly with their geese's peak breeding season, when the birds required the highest quality nutrition to support egg production and the subsequent demands of raising goslings. But the scheduling meant that just as the goslings reached their most vulnerable stage and needed consistent access to familiar territory, Thornham would be forced to relocate their entire flock to accommodate Eastwick's summer grazing rights. The economic consequences of this disruption rippled through all aspects of village life in ways that the bailiff had failed to anticipate. Geese that were forced to relocate during critical periods experienced stress that reduced their productivity, increased their susceptibility to disease, and disrupted the social relationships within flocks that were essential to successful breeding programs. The mortality rates among goslings increased significantly when their mothers were forced to navigate unfamiliar territory while defending their young against predators and environmental hazards. Walter Carpenter's original transgressional, allowing his goose to wander across an invisible boundary line, had evolved into a legal precedent that undermined the traditional management systems that had sustained rural communities for centuries. The rotating access schedule created artificial scarcity where none had previously existed, forcing communities to compete for resources that had formerly been managed through informal cooperation and mutual accommodation. The documentation required to implement the bailiff's decision created its own burden on communities that possessed limited literacy and no tradition of maintaining complex written records. Each village was required to designate officials responsible for monitoring compliance with the rotating schedule, recording violations, and reporting disputes to higher authorities. These positions represented additional administrative costs that strained community resources while producing no tangible benefits for the people, who ultimately bore the expense. The legal fees associated with the boundary dispute consumed resources that all three villages could ill afford, particularly given the economic pressures that were building throughout rural England in the months before the Peasants' Revolt. BBC History notes that by November 1380, the third poll tax in 4 years is agreed by Parliament, adding to the financial burdens that were already straining rural communities to their breaking point. The psychological impact of the prolonged dispute proved as damaging as its economic consequences. Neighbors who had cooperated for decades found themselves viewing each other with suspicion and resentment that poisoned social relationships essential to community survival. Children who had played together across village boundaries were now taught to regard their former friends as potential threats to their family's economic security. The social capital that had enabled informal cooperation and mutual assistance was systematically destroyed by legal seed. Meagle seed bewided beagle seedies. Meagle seed, meagle seedies, matey seed, meagle seed, meaty. Meaty seed, a plus seed bercod. Mead seed becomed a place seed, mead seed. We see me, we plus seed, I concede, see me seed. I play at seedy, it be reseed to be si whiz. we take pled, I see oid psychak nisse will a sikli sikakanet, but to eek a clay to me it's so sit of a kitis lurts, it's kitis la I to pupzia to kick this sit these called gabapetis that taltis woody at a stidid gert pathetic, but that's got to bend would you look at this got. Procedures that treated communities as competing entities rather than interdependent parts of a larger social system. Sir William de Burgh's involvement in the dispute revealed the broader political implications of seemingly local conflicts over resource access. The knight's feudal authority theoretically gave him the power to resolve the dispute through executive decision. But his own interest in maintaining stable relationships with all three villages made him reluctant to impose solutions that would generate lasting resentment among his tenants. His position illustrated the challenges facing feudal authorities as traditional power relationships adapted to post-plague social and economic realities. The Church's role in the dispute proved equally complex and ultimately unhelpful. Both villages appealed to religious authorities for support of their territorial claims, citing ancient privileges and traditional relationships that supposedly confirmed their grazing rights. But ecclesiastical authorities were reluctant to take positions that might alienate communities whose financial support was essential to their institution's survival. The Church's traditional role as mediator in community disputes was compromised by its own economic interests and political relationships. The winter of 138-01381 provided a harsh test of the bailiff's rotational system as all three villages struggled to provide adequate nutrition for their livestock during the lean months when natural forage was unavailable. The shared winter access to disputed territory created logistical nightmares as herders from different communities attempted to coordinate their activities while maintaining their animals' welfare. Conflicts over the best grazing spots, access to water sources, and priority during severe weather conditions generated daily disputes that required constant siege administrative intervention. The administrative burden of managing the rotational system consumed resources that might otherwise have been devoted to productive activities. Village officials spent increasing amounts of time documenting compliance with the complex scheduling requirements, investigating alleged violations, and preparing reports for higher authorities who demanded detailed accountability for the systems. Implementation. The time and energy devoted to these administrative tasks represented a pure loss to communities that desperately needed to focus their limited resources on survival and economic recovery. By spring 1381, all three villages were experiencing the full consequences of Master Robert's well-intentioned compromise. Livestock productivity had declined due to stress and inconsistent access to optimal grazing conditions. Social relationships within and between communities had been damaged by months of suspicion and conflict. Economic resources had been diverted from productive investments to administrative and legal expenses that generated no return. The original dispute over Walter Carpenter's wandering goose had been resolved in name only, while creating dozens of new problems that promised to generate conflicts for years to come. The broader historical significance of this local dispute would become apparent in the summer of 1381, when the tensions that had been building throughout rural England exploded into the peasants' revolt. The same grievances over traditional rights, administrative burdens, and economic pressures that had complicated the goose boundary dispute were reflected in the broader social movement that challenged the fundamental structures of medieval English society. Local conflicts over resource access were symptoms of systemic problems that could not be resolved through administrative adjustments or legal compromises. The legacy of the Commons War that began with a single goose crossing an invisible line would persist long after the immediate participants had died or moved away. The legal precedents established by Master Robert's decision would be cited in similar disputes throughout the region. creating a cascade of administrative complexity. That made efficient resource management increasingly difficult. The social damage caused by the prolonged conflict would influence relationships between communities for generations. As traditional cooperation was replaced by formal legal mechanisms that were expensive, inflexible, and often counterproductive. What lessons might we draw from this medieval conflict about the challenges of managing shared resources and resolving disputes in communities where survival depends on cooperation, but where competing interests make cooperation increasingly difficult to maintain? You are awake before the bells of matins ring across the Suffolk countryside. Not because duty calls you from your straw mattress, but because something is wrong in the darkness outside your family's cottage. The sound that woke you, or perhaps the absence of expected sound, speaks to instincts developed through months of tending Hinderclay Manor's geese. Instincts that recognize the subtle changes in the night's rhythm, that signal danger to your precious charges. The silence is what troubles you most. 23 geese do not sleep in perfect quiet, even on the most peaceful nights. There should be soft rustling as birds adjust their positions, occasional low murmurs as they communicate with flockmates. The gentle sounds of preening and settling that characterize healthy birds at rest. The complete absence of these familiar sounds suggests either that your flock has been scattered by some disturbance, or that they remain motionless in the grip of fear that keeps them frozen in their shelter. Your bare feet find the cold earthen floor as you slip from the shared sleeping area where your family clusters around the banked embers of the central hearth. The darkness is complete. No moon penetrates the thick cloud cover that promises rain before dawn, and the dying coals provide barely enough light to navigate around the sleeping forms of your parents and younger siblings. Your movement must be silent. Waking the household would bring questions you cannot yet answer and assistance you may not need. The wooden staff that serves as your badge of office as Hinderclay's goose girl lies beside the door, its familiar weight reassuring in your 12-year-old hands. The hazel rod has become an extension of your will over the months since Master Edmund appointed you to this position. But tonight, it may serve purposes beyond simple herding. Notes that medieval livestock guardians had to protect their charges from predators while grazing. But the threat is more immediate and personal when it invades the supposed safety of close established shelters. The door of your family's cottage opens with the careful deliberation that medieval hinges required too fast, and the leather pivots will squeal loud enough to wake the entire village. Too slow, and the accumulated strain may release in a sudden crack that alerts whatever predator might be stalking your flock. The cold air that greets you carries scents that confirm your growing suspicions. The musky odor of fox, recent enough to suggest the animal is still in the immediate vicinity. Foxes represent one of the most persistent threats to medieval poultry operations, combining intelligence, persistence, and physical capabilities that make them formidable adversaries for young herders. British agricultural history records specific instances of fox predation, noting that in 1318 293 geese were devoured by foxes at Hindalveston, a loss that represented significant economic damage to that manor's livestock program. The economic implications of fox predation extended far beyond the immediate value of individual birds lost to attacks. Each goose represented multiple forms of value within the medieval agricultural system: immediate meat for consumption or sale, eggs for nutrition and breeding, feathers for bedding and arrows, and the potential for producing goslings that would expand the flock in future seasons. The loss of mature breeding birds disrupted carefully planned production cycles that took years to fully restore. Your approach to the goose shelter requires navigating the complex geography of Hinderclay's farmyard in complete darkness, relying on mental maps developed through daily familiarity with every obstacle, depression, and hazard that might trip unwary feet or announce your presence to watching predators. The layout reflects centuries of evolution as successive generations of occupants added structures, modified drainage, and created the pathways that connected various functional areas of the agricultural complex. The goose house itself represents a significant investment of resources and labor. Constructed with materials that were expensive and difficult to obtain in medieval rural communities. The timber frame required trees of specific sizes and qualities, shaped with tools that were valuable family possessions passed down through generations. The thatch roof demanded specialized skills possessed by relatively few individuals, whose services commanded premium prices. During construction seasons, when multiple projects competed for their expertise, the architectural details of medieval poultry housing reflected hard-won knowledge about the specific requirements of different species and the environmental challenges that threatened their survival. Geese required different accommodations than chickens, with higher walls to contain birds capable of flight, stronger construction to resist the considerable force that large waterfowl could exert against barriers, and drainage systems that managed the substantial amounts of water that geese required for drinking and bathing as you approach the shelter. The absence of normal sounds becomes more ominous. Healthy geese respond to approaching footsteps with soft vocalizations that acknowledge familiar presences while expressing mild curiosity about nighttime disturbances. The continued silence suggests either that the birds have been frightened into immobility by perceived threats, or that they are no longer present to respond to your approach. The construction of the goose house included features specifically designed to deter predator access while providing adequate ventilation and natural lighting for the birds' welfare. The walls extended several inches below ground level to prevent digging access, while the roof design included overhangs that made climbing approaches difficult for cats, martens, and other predators capable of scaling vertical surfaces. The single entrance was equipped with a heavy wooden door that could be securely fastened to prevent nighttime intrusions. Your inspection of the shelter's exterior reveals evidence that confirms your worst fears. Scattered feathers near the entrance indicate a struggle, while scratch marks on the wooden doorframe suggest determined efforts to gain access to the interior. The pattern of damage is consistent with fox activity, intelligent, persistent, and focused on exploiting any weakness in the structure's defenses that might provide access to the valuable prey within. The medieval understanding of fox behavior was based on generations of accumulated experience with these adaptable predators, knowledge that was passed down through oral tradition and hard-learned lessons about their hunting strategies and preferences. Foxes were known to be patient hunters, willing to invest considerable time and effort in accessing prey that other predators might abandon after initial unsuccessful attempts. Their intelligence made them capable of learning from failed attempts and modifying their approaches to overcome defensive measures. The tracking skills that medieval rural communities developed through necessity allowed experienced observers to read the story written in disturbed earth, displaced objects, and other subtle signs that revealed recent activities. The evidence around your goose shelter tells a clear narrative of systematic exploration as the fox investigated every possible means of access, testing the strength of barriers and searching for gaps or weaknesses that might be exploited. The psychological impact of predator attacks on young herders represented one of the hidden costs of medieval livestock management that official records rarely documented. The responsibility for protecting valuable animals created constant stress for children who lacked the physical strength or experience to defend their charges against determined predators. Successful attacks generated feelings of guilt and failure that could influence a child's confidence and future. Performance in agricultural roles, the social implications of livestock losses extended beyond immediate economic damage to include questions about competence, reliability, and fitness for trusted positions within the manor's hierarchy. A herder who lost animals to predation might face reassignment to less critical duties, reducing their family's income and status within the community. The fear of such consequences added psychological pressure that made nighttime vigils, like your current investigation, particularly stressful for young workers. As you complete your exterior examination of the goose shelter, the evidence suggests that the fox's initial attempt to access your flock was unsuccessful. The door remains secure, and the walls show no signs of being breached. But the absence of normal sounds from within indicates that something has disturbed your birds, severely enough to alter their typical nighttime behavior. The next phase of your investigation requires opening the shelter and conducting an interior inspection that will reveal whether your charges have survived the night's encounter with their ancient enemy. What will you discover when you open the door to confront whatever aftermath awaits inside the goose shelter? And how will this night's events influence your developing understanding of the constant vigilance required to protect vulnerable livestock in medieval England? The heavy wooden door of the goose shelter opens with the deliberate care that experience has taught you to exercise when entering spaces where frightened birds might panic and injure themselves in desperate attempts to escape perceived threats. The darkness within is absolute, broken only by the faint gray light that filters through the narrow gaps between wallboards that provide essential ventilation while maintaining security. Your entrance brings immediate response from the flock's soft honking and the rustle of feathers as 23 voices announce their survival of the night's ordeal. The relief that washes over you at hearing those familiar sounds is immediately tempered by the realization that your responsibilities as Hinderclay's goose girl have only begun. The fox's unsuccessful attempt to breach the shelter represents a temporary victory that could be reversed at any moment if the predator remains in the vicinity or if the experience has taught it new approaches that might prove more successful. In future attempts, your morning inspection must assess not only the immediate status of your charges, but also their psychological condition and the shelter's continuing effectiveness against persistent threats. The interior geography of the goose house becomes familiar territory as your eyes adjust to the minimal lighting conditions. The birds have arranged themselves according to the social hierarchies and personal preferences that govern all aspects of flock behavior, with dominant individuals claiming the most protected positions while subordinate birds accept less favorable locations closer to walls or doorways. This natural organization provides immediate visual confirmation that the flock remains intact and has not been scattered by panic during the night's disturbance. Your count proceeds with the methodical precision that Master Edmund has drilled into your consciousness through months of daily accountability. Each bird must be individually identified and assessed, a process that requires intimate knowledge of the subtle physical characteristics that distinguish one goose from another within what might appear to casual observers as a uniform group of white waterfowl. Variations in size, posture, feather patterns, and behavioral traits create individual signatures that experienced herders learn to recognize instantly. The counting process reveals the sophisticated understanding of animal behavior that medieval livestock management required. Geese are intelligent creatures with complex social relationships and individual personalities that influence their responses to stress, threat, and environmental changes. Some birds within your flock are naturally more nervous and alert, serving as early warning systems that detect threats while their calmer companions continue feeding or resting. Others are naturally aggressive, willing to confront potential predators with courage that compensates for their limited size and defensive capabilities. The physical examination that follows your initial count requires handling each bird individually to assess their condition after the night's traumatic experience. Your hands, trained through months of daily contact, can detect subtle changes in posture, weight, and muscle tension that indicate stress, injury, or illness that might not be immediately visible. The systematic approach reflects medieval societies, understanding that livestock health problems were often detected through touch and observation rather than the agnostic tools that would become available in later centuries. British agricultural history notes that medieval poultry mortality rates were exceedingly low, just over 4% on average. But this statistic concealed the reality that individual flocks could experience devastating losses during predator attacks or disease outbreaks that killed significant percentages of birds within short periods. Your careful inspection serves not only to document current conditions, but also to identify early warning signs that might prevent future disasters. The behavioral changes you observe in your flock provide insights into the psychological impact of predator encounters on domestic animals that medieval sources rarely documented in detail. Several birds show signs of heightened alertness that suggest continued anxiety about potential threats, while others display the lethargic behavior that sometimes follows intense stress. These responses will influence the flock's productivity, breeding success, and general welfare in ways that extend far beyond the immediate aftermath of the fox's attack. The damage assessment extends beyond the birds themselves to include the shelter's structural integrity and the effectiveness of its defensive features. The scratch marks on the doorframe indicate that the fox tested the strength of the wooden barriers with considerable determination, while disturbed earth around the foundation suggests attempts to dig underneath walls that extend below ground level, specifically to prevent such access. Roots. The maintenance implications of the night's events require careful consideration of resources and priorities that reflect the economic constraints facing medieval rural households. Repairs to damaged areas of the shelter will require materials that must be obtained through trade or barter arrangements with neighbors who possess the necessary skills and supplies. The time invested in strengthening defenses represents labor that cannot be devoted to other productive activities essential to family survival. The predator's behavior patterns, revealed through careful examination of physical evidence, demonstrate the intelligence and persistence that made foxes such formidable adversaries for medieval livestock keepers. The systematic exploration of every potential access point suggests problem-solving capabilities that would challenge defensive measures designed by humans, who possessed superior tools and construction techniques, but who might lack the predator's motivation and specialized adaptations. Your analysis of the fox's attack strategy reveals the importance of understanding predator behavior in developing effective defensive measures. The animal's approach combines stealth, patience, and systematic investigation of the shelter's vulnerabilities in ways that demonstrated considerable learning ability and behavioral flexibility. Future defensive measures would need to account for this intelligence and anticipate the predator's capacity to modify its approaches based on previous experiences. The broader implications of the night's events extend beyond the immediate threat to your specific flock to include the ongoing challenge of protecting valuable livestock in an environment where predation pressure was constant and defensive resources were limited. Notes that medieval livestock management required continuous vigilance against threats that could destroy months or years of careful breeding and husbandry work within single encounters. The economic calculation that governs your response to the fox threat reflects the harsh realities of medieval resource allocation, where every decision involved trade-offs between competing needs and priorities. Strengthening the goose shelter's defenses would require investments that might compromise other essential projects, while inadequate protection could result in losses that would devastate your family's economic position within the manor's hierarchy. The social dimensions of predator management in medieval communities involved complex networks of cooperation and mutual assistance that supplemented individual defensive measures. Neighbors shared information about predator movements, coordinated hunting efforts to reduce local populations, and provided assistance during critical periods when individual families lacked the resources to protect their livestock adequately. Your experience with the fox attack would contribute to this collective knowledge base while potentially generating reciprocal obligations for future assistance as the morning light strengthens and the time approaches for driving your flock to their daily grazing grounds. few face decisions that will influence both their immediate safety and their long-term productivity. The fox's presence in the immediate vicinity suggests that normal routines may need modification to account for heightened predation risk, while the flock's psychological condition requires careful management to prevent stress-related problems that could persist for weeks or months. The documentation of the night's events for Master Edmund's review requires balancing complete honesty about the threat against the need to demonstrate competent management that justifies continued trust in your abilities. Medieval administrative systems demanded accountability that could influence a herder's future assignments and economic opportunities, creating incentives for minimizing reported problems while ensuring that necessary defensive measures received appropriate support. What strategies will prove most effective for protecting your flock against future predator attacks? And how will the night's encounter influence your developing expertise as a medieval livestock guardian? The week following the fox's nocturnal assault on your goose shelter brings a series of encounters that transform your understanding of medieval predator management from theoretical knowledge into practical survival skills essential for protecting valuable livestock. The initial attack was merely the opening move in a campaign of patience and intelligence that would test every defensive measure and traditional strategy that rural communities had developed through generations of experience with these adaptable adversaries. Master Edmund's response to your report of the fox incident reflects the serious economic implications of predator threats to manor-based agricultural operations. Rather than dismissing the event as an isolated occurrence, the steward immediately authorized additional resources for strengthening the shelter's defenses and implementing enhanced security measures that would protect the entire poultry operation. His decision to invest in improved predator defenses demonstrates the manor's recognition that livestock losses could seriously impact the complex economic calculations that determined annual profitability. The defensive improvements begin with structural modifications to the goose shelter that address the specific vulnerabilities revealed by the fox's systematic exploration of potential access points. Additional layers of stone are mortared into the foundation to extend the below-ground barriers that prevent digging access, while iron reinforcements strengthen the doorframe against the powerful claws and determined scratching that had left visible damage during the initial attack. British agricultural history notes that medieval livestock management required conducting them to local markets and other activities that exposed valuable animals to predation risks during transport and temporary housing. The defensive measures implemented at Hinderclay reflect broader strategies for protecting assets that represented significant investments of time, resources, and expertise that could not be easily replaced if lost to predator attacks. The community response to the fox threat reveals the collaborative approaches that medieval villages developed for managing shared challenges that affected multiple households. Word of the attack spreads through informal networks that connect families whose livelihoods depend on successful livestock management, generating offers of assistance, shared intelligence about predator movements, and coordinated defensive strategies that supplement individual protective measures. Thomas Miller, whose sheep had been attacked by the same fox 2 nights before your encounter, arrives with detailed observations about the predator's hunting patterns and behavioral characteristics that inform improved defensive planning. His description of the animal's size, coloration, and distinctive markings allows you to confirm that the same individual fox is responsible for multiple attacks in the immediate vicinity, suggesting territorial behavior that makes continued threats highly probable. The hunting party that forms in response to the escalating predator pressure includes men from 3 villages whose livestock operations have suffered actual or threatened losses during the fox's recent activities. Explains that medieval predator control involved hunting methods were poison, traps, pits, and dogs, though the specific techniques employed depend on local resources, expertise, and the characteristics of individual predators that required Elimination, your role in the hunting effort, reflects the unique knowledge that daily contact with targeted livestock provides about predator behavior and preferences. The timing of the fox's visits to your shelter, its approach routes, and the specific techniques it employed in attempting to gain access provide intelligence that experienced hunters can use to predict future behavior and plan effective countermeasures. The construction of traps and snares requires specialized knowledge that older villagers possess through decades of experience with predator control. The devices must be carefully positioned along routes that the fox has been observed to use, camouflaged to avoid detection by an intelligent animal that has learned to associate human scents and disturbances with danger, and designed to kill or capture without creating hazards for domestic animals or humans who might accidentally encounter them. The ethical considerations involved in medieval predator control reflect practical necessities rather than abstract philosophical concerns about animal welfare or ecological balance. Foxes that threaten valuable livestock must be eliminated quickly and efficiently to prevent continued losses that could threaten the economic survival of affected families. The methods employed were chosen for their effectiveness rather than their humaneness, though medieval hunters generally preferred techniques that minimized suffering when practical alternatives were available. The waiting period that follows. Trap deployment tests the patience and vigilance that successful predator control requires. Medieval hunting techniques often depended on passive devices that worked without human supervision, but their effectiveness required careful monitoring to ensure proper function and prompt response when captures occurred. Your daily routine expands to include checking trap locations and reporting any signs of predator activity that might indicate the need for modifications to current strategies. The fox's intelligence becomes apparent as it adapts to new threats and defensive measures with behavioral changes that challenge traditional hunting approaches. Tracks in soft earth reveal route modifications that avoid areas where traps have been placed, while the timing of visits shifts to periods when human activity is minimal and detection risks are reduced. These adaptations demonstrate learning capabilities that make experienced predators particularly challenging adversaries for medieval hunting techniques. The psychological impact of prolonged predator pressure affects both human and animal behavior in ways that compromise normal agricultural activities. Your geese remain nervous and alert, reducing their feeding efficiency and affecting their general health in ways that could influence egg production and breeding success. Your own stress levels increase as constant vigilance becomes necessary to detect threats that could materialize at any time without warning. The economic calculations involved in sustained predator control efforts reveal the challenging trade-offs that medieval communities faced when valuable resources were required to address immediate threats. The time invested in hunting activities reduces labor available for essential agricultural work, while the materials used in trap construction represent investments that generate no productive return beyond the PHL elimination of threats to existing assets. The breakthrough in the hunting campaign comes during the third week of sustained effort, when accumulated intelligence about the fox's modified behavior patterns allows the hunters to anticipate its movements and position traps more effectively. The successful capture eliminates the immediate threat while providing valuable experience that enhances the community's capacity to address similar challenges in the future. The aftermath of successful predator elimination involves careful examination of the captured animal to gather information that might inform future defensive strategies. The fox's physical condition provides insights into its hunting success and general health, while examination of its digestive contents reveals the range of prey species that were being targeted and the relative importance of domestic livestock within its overall diet. The broader lessons learned from the extended encounter with predator threats extend beyond the immediate tactical knowledge gained through direct experience. The collaborative approaches developed during the hunting campaign strengthen community relationships and establish Precedents for cooperative responses to future challenges that affect multiple households. The defensive improvements implemented. At individual holdings, create models that can be adapted by other livestock keepers facing similar threats. The seasonal timing of predator encounters reflects broader ecological patterns that medieval agricultural communities needed to understand. For effective resource management, the fox's increased activity during late spring and early summer corresponds to the breeding season, when adult animals require additional nutrition to support reproduction and the subsequent demands of raising young. Understanding these patterns allows livestock keepers to anticipate periods of heightened risk and implement appropriate defensive measures. As summer progresses and your flock benefits from improved defenses and reduced predator pressure, the experiences of recent weeks contribute to your developing expertise as a medieval livestock guardian. The practical knowledge gained through direct encounters with threats supplements theoretical understanding passed down through oral tradition, creating the foundation for future success in protecting valuable animals against the constant dangers that characterize rural life in 14th century England. What long-term implications might these experiences have for your continued development as a skilled practitioner of medieval animal husbandry? And how do the lessons learned during predator encounters prepare you for the other challenges that await as the agricultural season progresses toward harvest time? August 1380 arrives with atmospheric conditions that experienced farmers recognize as harbingers of trouble, though the full implications of what they observe will not become apparent until weeks later, when the harvest season reaches its critical phase. You notice the changes first in your geese, whose sensitivity to barometric pressure and subtle environmental shifts makes them reliable predictors of weather patterns that will ultimately determine the success or failure of Hinderclay Manors. Agricultural year. The behavioral modifications you observe in your flock reflect evolutionary adaptations that have allowed waterfowl to survive dramatic environmental changes over millennia. But their nervous energy and altered feeding patterns suggest atmospheric disturbances that could threaten both animal welfare and human survival if they persist or intensify. The geese spend increasing amounts of time with their heads raised, scanning skies that appear normal to human observation, but apparently contain signals that trigger ancestral memories of seasonal transitions and environmental threats. Documents that solar activity records show a decline from 1250 to 1350, a brief rise from 1350 to 1380, and then a phenomenal low that lasted until 1500. Placing your experience within a broader pattern of climatic instability that would profoundly influence European agriculture and society during the late medieval period. The year 1380 represents a critical transition point when temporary climatic recovery gave way to renewed cooling that would contribute to social upheavals, including the peasants' revolt. The morning sky displays the subtle color variations that rural populations learn to interpret as indicators of atmospheric pressure changes and wind pattern shifts that predict short-term weather developments. Experienced observers can read these signs with accuracy that rivals modern meteorological forecasting, though their interpretations are based on accumulated traditional knowledge rather than scientific understanding of the physical processes that govern weather systems. Your daily routine as Hinderclay's goose girl provides constant opportunities to observe environmental changes that affect both animal behavior and agricultural conditions. The grazing patterns of your flock reflect the quality and availability of natural forage, which varies according to rainfall, temperature, and seasonal progression in ways that influence the entire manor's economic calculations. Reduced grass growth or early senescence could force increased reliance on stored grain reserves, affecting both animal nutrition and human food security. The complex relationship between weather patterns and medieval agricultural systems involved multiple variables that determine success or failure across entire regions. Timing was critical. Excessive rain during planting seasons could prevent seed germination, while drought during growing periods could destroy crops before harvest. Temperature variations affected the length of growing seasons and the quality of grain production, while unexpected storms could devastate crops that were ready for harvest. The morning feeding behavior of your geese provides early indicators of forage quality changes that reflect broader environmental conditions affecting all vegetation in the area. Their preference for certain areas of the commons and their rejection of previously favored locations suggests subtle changes in plant nutrition and palatability that could influence the success of grain crops that were approaching their final stages of development. Master Edmund's increased attention to weather signs reflects the manor's growing concern about harvest prospects that were becoming increasingly uncertain as atmospheric conditions deviated from normal seasonal patterns. His conversations with other agricultural officials reveal shared anxiety about environmental conditions that could affect the entire region's ability to produce sufficient food for winter survival, particularly given the social tensions that were building throughout rural England. The geese require supplemental feeding earlier than usual as natural forage quality declines in response to environmental stresses that affect plant growth and nutrition. The additional grain consumption represents an unexpected expense that strains the manor's carefully calculated resource allocations, while indicating broader agricultural problems that could affect human nutrition if current trends continue through the harvest season. British agricultural history notes that medieval goose management required feeding them with grain and legumes, mostly for fattening, but the timing and quantity of supplemental feeding were normally determined by seasonal factors and market considerations rather than emergency responses to environmental problems. The early need for additional nutrition suggests that normal agricultural cycles were being disrupted by weather patterns that threatened multiple aspects of food production. The psychological impact of environmental uncertainty affects both human and animal behavior in ways that compound the practical challenges of managing agricultural operations during periods of climatic instability. Your geese display increased nervousness and altered social interactions that reflect stress, responses to environmental changes they cannot understand, but instinctively recognize as threats to their survival. The village conversations that you overhear during daily trips to the commons reveal growing concern about harvest prospects among families whose survival depends on successful grain production. The traditional signs that guide agricultural decision-making are providing conflicting information about optimal timing for various activities. While environmental conditions seem to change faster than human responses can adapt to new circumstances, the increased frequency of unusual cloud formations and wind patterns suggests atmospheric instability that could generate sudden storms, capable of devastating crops that are approaching maturity. Medieval agricultural systems possessed limited ability to protect grain crops against severe weather events, making successful harvest dependent on favorable conditions. During the critical weeks when grain reached optimal ripeness and required immediate attention, your observations of bird behavior extend beyond your domestic flock to include wild species whose migration patterns and feeding behaviors provide additional information about environmental conditions that affect the broader ecosystem. Changes in the timing of seasonal movements and the species composition of local bird populations suggest environmental pressures that could influence agricultural success throughout the region. The water levels in ponds and streams that provide essential resources for both human and animal populations reflect precipitation patterns that will ultimately determine the success of grain crops that require adequate moisture during their final stages of development. Reduced water availability could force difficult choices between human consumption, animal welfare, and agricultural needs that would influence survival prospects for entire communities. The social implications of environmental uncertainty become apparent as communities begin to reassess their resource allocation strategies and emergency preparations for potential harvest failures. Families that had planned to sell surplus grain to generate income for other necessities might instead need to retain all production for subsistence, while those who depended on purchased grain could face severe shortages. Regional production declined significantly. The traditional knowledge that guides agricultural decision-making includes accumulated wisdom about recognizing and responding to environmental threats. But the current conditions seem to combine familiar elements in unfamiliar patterns that challenge conventional approaches to weather prediction and agricultural planning. The elderly villagers, whose memories span multiple decades of agricultural cycles, express uncertainty about interpreting signs that have never appeared in quite these combinations before. The morning mist that rises from the common pasture displays optical qualities that suggest unusual humidity levels and temperature gradients in the atmosphere above Hinderclay Manor. These subtle visual cues, barely perceptible to inexperienced observers, provide experienced farmers with information about atmospheric conditions that could influence local weather patterns over the coming days and weeks. Your geese show increasing reluctance to venture far from their shelter during grazing periods, behavior that suggests instinctive responses to environmental pressures that human senses cannot directly detect. Their preference for staying close to familiar territory may reflect evolutionary adaptations that helped their ancestors survive sudden weather changes that could trap animals far from shelter during critical periods. The feeding schedule that has governed your flock's daily routine throughout the summer begins to require modifications as environmental conditions affect both the bird's nutritional needs and the availability of natural forage. The increased energy expenditure associated with stress responses and temperature regulation demands higher caloric intake precisely when pasture quality is declining due to environmental pressures that affect plant growth and nutritional content. The economic implications of early supplemental feeding extend beyond the immediate cost of additional grain to include broader questions about resource allocation strategies that must account for uncertainty about future conditions. If environmental problems persist or worsen, the grain used to maintain your geese in optimal condition might be needed for human nutrition. During winter months when other food sources become unavailable, Master Edmund's daily inspections of the manor's various agricultural operations reveal patterns of environmental stress that affect multiple aspects of food production simultaneously. The grain crops show subtle signs of moisture stress despite adequate rainfall, while vegetable gardens display growth patterns that suggest soil temperature variations that could affect productivity during the crucial final weeks before harvest. The atmospheric pressure changes that influence your geese's behavior also affect human physiology in ways that medieval populations recognized but could not scientifically explain. Many villagers report headaches, joint pain, and sleep disturbances that traditional knowledge associates with weather changes. Though the specific mechanisms remain beyond contemporary understanding of human biology and environmental interactions, the wind patterns that develop during late August display characteristics that experienced observers associate with major weather system transitions that could bring dramatic changes in temperature, precipitation, and storm activity. The direction and intensity of air movements provide clues about the atmospheric dynamics that will determine regional weather patterns during the critical harvest period that lies ahead. Your observations of insect activity around the goose pasture provide additional indicators of environmental conditions that could influence agricultural success. Changes in the timing and intensity of insect emergence cycles suggest temperature and moisture patterns that affect not only pest pressure on crops, but also the availability of natural protein sources that contribute to waterfowl nutrition. During their natural feeding cycles, the water quality in streams and ponds that serve both human and animal populations reflects environmental conditions that could influence health outcomes during periods when communities depend heavily on local water sources. Unusual algae growth patterns and changes in water clarity suggest nutrient dynamics that might indicate broader ecological changes affecting the entire watershed. The nesting behavior of wild birds that inhabit the area around Hinder Clay Manor provides insights into environmental conditions that extend beyond immediate weather patterns. To include longer-term seasonal trends that could influence agricultural planning for the following year. Species that typically begin autumn preparations during late August show altered timing that suggests environmental cues are different from normal seasonal patterns. The social dynamics within your goose flock reflect environmental stresses in ways that could affect their productivity and general welfare during the critical months ahead. Increased competition for preferred feeding locations and changes in the dominance relationships that normally maintain flock stability suggest that environmental pressures are disrupting the social structures that contribute to successful group functioning. The maintenance requirements for the goose shelter increase as environmental conditions place additional demands on structures that must provide protection against weather extremes that may exceed normal seasonal expectations. The integrity of the thatched roof and the effectiveness of drainage systems become more critical as atmospheric conditions suggest possible severe weather events that could test defensive capabilities. The broader regional context of environmental change becomes apparent as travelers and traders bring reports of similar conditions affecting agricultural operations throughout Suffolk and neighboring counties. The consistency of these reports suggests that local environmental problems reflect larger atmospheric patterns that could influence food production across wide areas of England. The timing of environmental changes relative to the agricultural calendar creates particular challenges for communities that depend on successful harvest outcomes to survive the winter months ahead. Crops that were planted according to traditional schedules based on normal seasonal patterns may not be adequately prepared for environmental conditions that deviate significantly from historical experience. Your role as goose grower provides unique opportunities to observe environmental changes from the perspective of animals whose survival depends on accurate assessment of threats and opportunities within their immediate environment. The insights gained through daily contact with creatures whose instincts are finely tuned to environmental conditions offer information that complements human observations and traditional knowledge about weather prediction and agricultural planning. The accumulating evidence of environmental instability forces. Recognition that the 1380 harvest season may present challenges that exceed the scope of normal agricultural planning and resource management strategies. The combination of unusual weather patterns, altered animal behavior, and environmental stresses affecting multiple aspects of the local ecosystem suggests that adaptation strategies may be required to address conditions that fall outside the range of traditional agricultural experience as August progresses toward September and the critical harvest period approaches. The environmental signs you observe through your daily work with the goose flock contribute to a growing awareness that the season ahead may test the resilience and stability of medieval agricultural systems in ways that will influence not only immediate survival, but also long-term social and economic stability throughout rural England. What specific challenges will emerge as environmental conditions continue to evolve? And how will the accumulated stresses of unusual weather patterns affect the complex interactions between human communities, domestic animals, and agricultural systems that determine survival prospects during the harsh winter months that lie ahead? The second week of September brings weather conditions that transform environmental concerns into immediate survival challenges. As atmospheric disturbances that had been building throughout late summer coalesce into storm systems of unprecedented intensity and duration. Your morning inspection of the goose flock reveals birds huddled in defensive postures that reflect their instinctive responses to barometric pressure changes that herald approaching severe weather, though the full scope of what approaches remains beyond human prediction or preparation. The wind patterns that develop during the pre-dawn hours display characteristics that experienced farmers recognize as harbingers of major storm activity. but the intensity and persistence of atmospheric disturbances exceed anything within living memory of Hinderklay's agricultural community. The combination of unusually warm air masses moving north from the continent and cold fronts descending from Scotland creates unstable atmospheric conditions that generate sudden temperature changes and violent precipitation that threaten both crops and livestock. Documents that the late 14th century experienced unusual weather patterns, including high precipitation, drought, and extreme cold or heat, placing your experience within broader patterns of climatic instability that would influence agricultural productivity and social conditions throughout Europe during this critical period. Your geese demonstrate remarkable sensitivity to approaching weather changes, displaying behavioral modifications that begin hours before human observers detect any obvious signs of atmospheric disturbance. Their reluctance to venture far from shelter increased vocalizations that seem to communicate anxiety within the flock, and altered feeding patterns that suggest preparation for extended periods of confinement all indicate instinctive responses to environmental pressures that evolution has programmed into waterfowl. Survival strategies. The first major storm arrives with suddenness that catches even experienced weather observers unprepared for its intensity and duration. The initial wind gusts exceed anything that the manor's agricultural structures were designed to withstand, while the accompanying precipitation falls with volume and persistence that quickly overwhelm drainage systems and create flooding conditions that threaten both crops and livestock throughout the immediate area. The goose shelter's construction, which had seemed more than adequate for normal weather protection, faces its most severe test as wind-driven rain finds every gap in the thatching and creates interior conditions that threaten the health and welfare of your flock. The birds cluster together for warmth and mutual protection, but their stress is evident in vocalizations that express distress and confusion about environmental conditions that exceed their adaptive capabilities. Master Edmund's emergency response to the storm demonstrates the manor's recognition that extreme weather events require immediate action to protect valuable assets that represent months or years of investment and careful management. Additional workers are assigned to reinforce vulnerable structures, while emergency supplies of grain and fodder are relocated to secure storage areas that can provide continued access to animal nutrition. Even if normal feeding routines becomes impossible, the broader implications of severe weather extend beyond immediate threats to property and livestock to include disruption of agricultural activities that are time-sensitive and cannot be postponed without serious consequences. The grain harvest, which requires precise timing to capture crops at optimal ripeness, faces potential disaster if weather conditions prevent fieldwork during the narrow window when successful harvesting remains possible. British agricultural history notes that medieval agricultural systems operated with minimal margins for error, making weather-related disruptions particularly threatening to communities that depended on successful seasonal outcomes for winter survival. The timing of the September storms coincides with the most critical period for grain harvest, creating potential for catastrophic losses that could affect food security throughout the region. The psychological impact of severe weather on both human and animal populations reflects the vulnerability of medieval agricultural systems to environmental forces beyond human control. Your geese displays signs of chronic stress that could affect their long-term health and productivity, while human anxiety about harvest outcomes creates tension throughout the community as people recognize their powerlessness against natural forces that threaten their survival. The structural damage to agricultural buildings throughout Hinderklay Manor reveals the limitations of medieval construction techniques when confronted with extreme weather events that exceed normal design parameters. Thatched roofs that provide adequate protection under normal conditions prove vulnerable to wind-driven rain and prolonged precipitation that eventually penetrates even the most carefully constructed barriers. The flooding that accompanies the prolonged precipitation creates additional challenges for livestock management as normal grazing areas become inaccessible and alternative. Feed sources must be provided to maintain animal nutrition during extended periods of confinement. The economic implications of emergency feeding extend beyond immediate costs to include concerns about depleting grain reserves that were intended to last through the winter months. The community response to weather-related emergencies demonstrates both the strengths and limitations of medieval social support systems during crisis periods. Neighbors cooperate to protect shared resources and assist families whose circumstances make them particularly vulnerable to weather-related damage. But the resources available for mutual assistance are limited when multiple households face similar challenges simultaneously. The second major storm system arrives within days of the first, compounding damage and creating cumulative effects that exceed the manor's capacity to respond effectively through normal resource allocation and emergency procedures. The repetitive nature of severe weather events suggests atmospheric patterns that could persist for weeks or months, threatening the entire agricultural calendar and forcing reconsideration of traditional approaches to seasonal planning. Your daily responsibilities. As Goose Girl expand to include emergency management tasks that were never anticipated when you accepted the position. Monitoring the bird's condition during extended confinement requires skills in recognizing stress-related health problems, while maintaining their nutrition during periods when normal feeding routines become impossible demands creativity and resource management that test your developing expertise. The regional scope of weather-related agricultural problems becomes apparent as communication networks carry reports of similar conditions affecting communities throughout East Anglia and beyond. The consistency of these reports suggests that local weather problems reflect broader atmospheric patterns that could influence food production across significant portions of England, creating potential for widespread shortages that would affect social and economic stability. The grain crops that survive the initial storms face additional threats from prolonged moisture conditions that promote disease organisms and pest problems that could destroy harvests, even if weather conditions eventually improve enough to permit fieldwork. The combination of environmental stresses creates cascading effects that multiply the challenges facing agricultural communities during this critical season. The water management problems created by excessive precipitation and inadequate drainage reveal infrastructure limitations that become critical during extreme weather events. Flooded fields cannot be harvested even if crops remain viable, while saturated soils may be unable to support the heavy equipment and animal labor required for traditional harvest techniques. The food storage facilities that were designed to protect harvested grain from normal environmental threats prove inadequate when confronted with unprecedented moisture levels and humidity conditions that promote spoilage and contamination. Emergency measures to protect stored food supplies require resources and expertise that may not be readily available during crisis periods when multiple problems demand simultaneous attention. As September progresses and weather conditions continue to challenge traditional agricultural practices, the cumulative effects of environmental stress begin to influence social relationships and community dynamics in ways that reflect growing anxiety about survival prospects during the winter months. Ahead, the traditional cooperation that sustains rural communities faces pressure as resource scarcity forces difficult choices about priorities and resource allocation. The broader historical context of the 1380 weather crisis includes its role in creating social tensions that would contribute to the peasants' revolt the following year. As environmental problems compounded existing grievances about taxation, social inequality, and economic hardship that affected rural populations throughout England. The immediate challenges of weather-related agricultural problems would become part of larger patterns of social upheaval that transformed English society. What long-term consequences will emerge from the agricultural disruptions caused by unprecedented weather conditions. And how will the experience of managing livestock during environmental crises influence your understanding of the complex relationships between natural forces? Human survival and social stability in medieval England. October arrives with the cruel clarity that follows devastating storms, revealing the full extent of agricultural losses that will reshape life at Hinderclay Manor and countless similar communities throughout England for years to come. Your morning inspection of the goose flock takes place against a landscape transformed by weather extremes that have fundamentally altered the economic foundation upon which medieval rural society depends. Though the complete implications of what has occurred will unfold slowly through the harsh winter months that lie ahead. The geese have survived the September storms physically intact, but their condition reflects the accumulated stress of weeks spent in confinement under emergency. Conditions that tested both their resilience and your developing skills as their guardian. Several birds show signs of respiratory problems that developed during prolonged exposure to damp conditions within shelters that were never designed to house livestock for extended periods, while others display behavioral changes that suggest psychological trauma from environmental experiences that exceeded their adaptive capabilities. The broader agricultural assessment that Master Edmund conducts throughout the manor's holdings reveals losses that approach catastrophic proportions. For a medieval economy that operated with minimal reserves and limited capacity to absorb sudden shocks to productive systems, nearly 40% of the grain harvest has been lost to weather damage, flooding, and the cascading effects of environmental conditions that prevented timely harvesting and proper storage of crops that survived the initial storms. British agricultural history indicates that successful medieval agricultural operations required careful balance between production, consumption, and reserve management that left little margin for unexpected losses. The scale of damage from the 1380 weather crisis forces fundamental reconsideration of resource allocation strategies and survival planning that will influence community life throughout the coming winter, and potentially for several years beyond. The economic calculations that govern your continued employment as Goose Girl reflect the harsh realities of resource scarcity that force difficult choices about priorities and essential activities. The manor's reduced income from agricultural sales means that expenses previously considered routine must now be evaluated for their absolute necessity, while positions that seem secure become vulnerable to elimination if they cannot be justified in terms of immediate survival needs. Your flock represents one of the few agricultural assets that has maintained most of its value despite the weather-related disasters that have devastated other aspects of the manor's productive capacity. Geese require less grain supplementation than other livestock species can continue producing eggs even under suboptimal conditions and provide multiple forms of economic value that make them particularly valuable during periods of general scarcity and economic hardship. The social dynamics within Hinderclay Village reflect growing tension. Neighbors who had previously cooperated easily in mutual assistance programs now calculate their own survival margins with care that makes generosity seem like dangerous luxury they cannot afford. The regional scope of agricultural losses becomes apparent as market systems that normally distribute food surpluses from productive areas to regions experiencing shortfalls break down due to widespread problems that affect most communities simultaneously. The transportation networks that connect rural producers with urban consumers face disruption from infrastructure damage, and the simple reality that there are insufficient surpluses to meet normal demand levels. The manor's relationships with ecclesiastical authorities become particularly important as the Church's traditional role in providing assistance during crisis periods faces unprecedented demands from communities throughout the region. The tithe obligations that normally flow from rural producers to religious institutions may need modification or suspension if communities lack sufficient resources to meet both survival needs and traditional religious obligations. Your developing expertise in goose management becomes increasingly valuable as the economic importance of successful poultry operations grows relative to other agricultural activities that have suffered devastating losses. The knowledge and skills you have acquired through months of daily contact with your flock represent human capital that could determine your family's survival prospects during the challenging period ahead. The preservation techniques that medieval communities used to extend the storage life of perishable foods become critical as normal food production cycles face disruption that could last through multiple seasons. Your geese provide opportunities to convert grain resources into preserved meat and rendered fat that offer superior storage characteristics. Compared to fresh foods that spoil quickly without adequate preservation infrastructure, the environmental recovery process begins slowly as weather patterns gradually return to more normal seasonal characteristics. But the damage to agricultural systems requires months or years of careful rebuilding that will test community resilience and adaptive capacity. Seed stocks for next year's planting have been compromised by storage problems and emergency consumption, while livestock populations have been reduced by mortality and forced sales that eliminated breeding animals essential for future production. The broader historical significance of the 1380 agricultural crisis includes its contribution to social tensions that would explode into the peasants' revolt the following year, as environmental disasters compounded existing grievances about taxation, social inequality, and economic policies that seemed to favor wealthy elites at the expense of rural populations who bore the heaviest burdens during crisis periods. BBC History notes that the third poll tax imposed in November 1380 came at precisely the time when rural communities were struggling to recover from agricultural disasters that had severely reduced their economic capacity to meet additional financial obligations. The combination of natural disasters and increased taxation created explosive conditions that would reshape English society. The lessons learned through your experience managing livestock during environmental crises contribute to practical knowledge that will influence agricultural practices for generations as communities adapt their survival strategies to account for the possibility of weather extremes that exceed traditional planning parameters. The behavioral observations and management techniques developed during emergency conditions provide insights that supplement traditional knowledge about animal husbandry. Under normal circumstances, the psychological impact of surviving major agricultural disasters influences individual and community attitudes toward risk, resource management, and social cooperation in ways that will shape decision-making long after immediate crisis conditions have passed. The experience of confronting environmental forces that threaten survival creates both trauma and resilience that affect how people approach future challenges and opportunities. The economic restructuring that follows major agricultural losses forces reconsideration of traditional relationships between social classes, economic activities, and resource allocation systems that had seemed stable for generations. Communities that survive environmental disasters often emerge with modified social structures and economic arrangements that reflect hard-won lessons about priorities and survival strategies during extreme conditions. As winter approaches and hinder clay manors, residents prepare for months of survival on reduced resources. Your continued role as Goose Girl represents both continuity with traditional agricultural practices and adaptation to changed circumstances that require flexibility and innovation. The skills and knowledge you have developed through direct experience with environmental challenges will influence not only your personal survival prospects, but also your community's capacity to rebuild and adapt to changing conditions. The broader implications of the 1380 agricultural crisis extend beyond immediate survival challenges to include long-term changes in medieval English society that would influence social, economic, and political development for centuries. The environmental disasters that threatened individual communities like Hinderclay Manor were part of larger patterns of change that would transform European civilization during the transition from medieval to early modern periods. Your personal journey from childhood to adolescence during this period of crisis and change reflects the broader human experience of adaptation and survival during historical transitions that test individual resilience and community solidarity. The mundane details of daily life as a medieval goose girl intersect with larger historical forces in ways that illustrate how ordinary people navigate extraordinary circumstances and contribute to the social changes that define historical periods. The story of your geese, your community, and your personal development during the challenging year of 1380 provides insights into the complex relationships between environmental conditions, agricultural systems, social structures, and individual experience that shaped medieval life and continue to influence human societies in their ongoing struggles to balance survival needs with social cooperation and economic development. The lessons learned through direct experience with environmental challenges, resource scarcity, and community survival remain relevant to contemporary efforts to address similar challenges in different but fundamentally comparable circumstances. As the year 1380 draws to its close and you reflect on the months that have transformed you from a village child into an experienced practitioner of medieval animal husbandry, the lessons learned through daily contact with your geese extend far beyond simple agricultural knowledge to encompass fundamental insights about survival, adaptation, and human resilience during periods of historical change and environmental challenge. The 23 birds under your care have survived predator attacks, weather extremes, and resource scarcity that tested every aspect of traditional livestock management. While your own development from inexperienced herder to skilled guardian reflects the broader capacity of medieval communities to adapt and survive during circumstances that challenged established systems and social relationships, the interconnected challenges of boundary disputes, predator management, environmental disasters, and social tensions that defined your experience as Hinderclays Goose Girl illustrate the complex reality of medieval rural life, where survival depended on mastering countless seemingly mundane details while navigating larger forces of historical change that would ultimately reshape English society through events like the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Your success in protecting and managing valuable livestock during this critical year demonstrates both the importance of traditional knowledge and the necessity of innovation and adaptation when circumstances exceed the scope of conventional approaches to agricultural challenges. The skills and insights gained through direct experience with environmental and social pressures would influence not only your personal future, but also your community's capacity to survive and prosper during the transformative period that lay ahead. The story of medieval goose herding in 1380, with all its mundane details and unexpected complexities, provides a window into the daily reality of historical change as experienced by ordinary people whose lives intersected with larger forces of social, economic, and environmental transformation that continue to shape human societies in their ongoing struggles to balance individual survival with community cooperation and social stability.